The Lover by Gregorio Martinez Sierra. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
The Queen, read by Jenn Broda.
The Lover, read by Todd.
The Lady in Waiting, read by Sonia.
Stage directions, read by Larry Wilson. Salon in a royal palace. Although of extreme richness, the furnishings preserve an atmosphere of simplicity. The stage is empty when the curtain rises. Loud shouts and cries are heard outside, as if an accident were taking place. Then various noises follow, clamor and confusion. After a moment the Queen enters, followed by the Lady in Waiting. The Queen is a beautiful woman, gowned in faultless taste. She is about 40 years of age. Her hair is very dark, except for a solitary white lock which appears almost directly above the middle of her forehead. But this she does not attempt to conceal by any artifice. She enters in full regalia, as if attired for some court ceremony. From her shoulders hangs the royal mantle. The Lady in Waiting is about 60 years of age, rather nobly plain. She also is in full court dress. The Queen, as she leaves the Lady in Waiting, who attempts to support her.
No, let me be. I am not hurt. It is nothing.
Has your Majesty suffered no injury?
None, I assure you.
Oh, but the shock, the fright! Be seated, your Majesty.
She assists her to remove the court mantle.
Your Majesty must rest. At least drink a glass of water.
The Queen, sitting herself in an armchair.
You may bring the water, but I will have nothing in it. Let it be as pure as God made it.
The Lady in Waiting brings the water from a table which stands near by.
But, your Majesty, it is cold. Your Majesty is overheated.
Give me the glass.
She takes it from the Lady in Waiting.
You are trembling all over.
Ah, your Majesty, you have no idea how frightened I was, how frightened we all were, when the horses reared in the traces. Your Majesty can imagine the overturn, the coach shattered into pieces, your Majesty thrown upon the ground.
The Queen, smiling.
Fortunately, there was somebody waiting to receive me. How fortunate that that man,
Laughing.
my knight-errant, was so near.
Lady in Waiting, displeased.
Certainly, your Majesty.
The Queen, looking at her for a moment, then laughing.
We shall have to award him the Grand Cross. Are you frowning?
Your Majesty.
But what is the matter? What is on your mind?
Your Majesty, that man was unmannerly and impertinent. Your Majesty will not be displeased, but his deportment was horribly incorrect. To catch your Majesty in his arms without permission.
Yes, if he had allowed me to break my neck, his conduct would have been more correct. In that case, he would not have committed a breach of etiquette. No, indeed. It is not every day that a woman, even if she is a queen, is in peril of her life and has the experience of being saved from death in a gallant's arms.
Your Majesty amuses herself.
Perhaps I do, but not unkindly. Poor fellow. However, you may malign him as much as you like.
Your Majesty, I do not malign him when I suggest that it is incorrect and impertinent for this person to follow your Majesty wherever you go.
The Queen, laughing.
Like my shadow.
Like a rude, ill-bred fellow who is ignorant of decency and of the requirements of etiquette. Your Majesty never leaves the palace but that he is standing on the pavement opposite. You cannot go to church, or to the theatre, or visit the parks, or attend any public ceremony, but that he is there in the front row, yes, or nearer than the front row, as he was today.
Fortunately for me.
Your Majesty, loyal vassals were not wanting to fly to your Majesty's assistance.
The Queen gently.
Yes, so I saw when the horses reared. Half a dozen dukes began to run, but what with etiquette, which kept them at a safe distance, and rheumatism, which would not permit them to run, my royal person was in grave danger.
Laughing.
Indeed, if it had not been for him.
Skulking in a bramble bush, like a lover in comic opera.
Love is no respecter of hiding places. It is foolish to laugh at hidden lovers, even in comic opera. Besides, what you say was a bramble bush appeared to me to be a laurel, and men take as naturally to laurels nowadays as they did in the time of Petrarch. Some of the leaves have even clung to my robe.
Picking off 2 or 3.
Almost enough to weave a crown for my lover.
Your Majesty surely does not imply that that man is in love.
Why not? Don't you think so?
He is utterly deficient, lacking. How do we know? Perhaps he may be
an anarchist. But how stupid! In the 20 years he has followed me, he never yet has found an opportunity.
Your Majesty!
The Queen laughing.
Of showing disrespect.
Does your Majesty consider that this extraordinary persecution shows no disrespect?
But what has become of him? Where is he?
He has been detained.
Where? For what reason?
For having introduced himself without permission into the palace gardens.
To save the life of his queen, the end justifies the means.
Your Majesty, he could scarcely have been advised beforehand that your Majesty's coach was to be overturned, and at that particular spot in the palace gardens.
Then you do not believe in presentiments.
Your Majesty, I am too old for such things.
The Queen with a note of melancholy in her voice.
So am I, for such things.
Your Majesty!
No, we both know how old I am, and so does the world. Decreeing her age is not one of the prerogatives of a queen.
Taking up a hand-glass, she gazes into it attentively.
Horrible, is it not?
Your Majesty is marvellously young.
Even so, marvels do not last long. Whenever I look into the mirror, I am aghast at the wrinkles which I shall find there very soon. I know, too, where they will come.
Indicating her eyes and mouth.
They show already when I laugh. Ah, when she is 20, how carelessly a woman laughs.
Putting down the mirror.
When I laugh, I cover my face with my fan. When I am 40, I shall have all the palace mirrors broken.
She recites simply,
When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow. You recall Shakespeare's sonnet. When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. Then being asked where all thy beauty lies, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, to say, within thy own deep sunken eyes, were an ill-eating shame and a thriftless praise. How much more praise deserved thy beauty's use, if thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count and make my old excuse, proving his beauty by succession thine. This were to be made new when thou art old, and feel thy blood warm when thou feelest it cold.
Sighing.
I have never had a child.
Your Majesty!
Affectionately but disapprovingly.
Your Majesty has no right to consider such a thing.
No, of course not. Ah.
Smiling again.
Do you suppose he could be a poet?
Why a poet?
Why not? In any case, we shall soon know.
We shall? How?
I shall ask, and learn his answer.
Surely your Majesty does not intend...
To receive him? Precisely.
But, your Majesty, he is nobody.
In that case, we shall become acquainted more easily. I shall offer him my thanks.
Your Majesty's government will thank him officially.
But he has saved me personally, and I shall thank him personally. I will receive him now.
Your Majesty.
If there is nothing else that you wish to suggest...
Unless your Majesty has changed her mind.
No, do not be alarmed. There is nothing to fear. Ah, and I will receive him alone.
As your Majesty commands.
She goes out. The Queen again takes the mirror and gazes into it fixedly. With a woman's instinct, she rearranges her hair, then laughs at herself and lays the mirror down again.
When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow.
The lady-in-waiting and the lover appear in the doorway. He is 40 years of age, neither well nor badly dressed. He wears a black sack suit. His beard is pointed, his hair somewhat long and slightly touched with gray. He comes forward greatly agitated. The lady-in-waiting retires.
Your Majesty.
No, come in.
The lover, advancing a step, then making a reverence.
Your Majesty.
Come nearer.
Your Majesty.
I have sent for you to offer my thanks.
I do not deserve them. Your Majesty will command.
It was a happy chance that brought you into the garden.
Yes, Your Majesty, yes.
And I am deeply grateful to you.
No, Your Majesty, no.
But I am. Indeed, I am.
Your Majesty will decide.
But how is it that you were able to gain admission to the gardens?
Very simply.
In spite of my guards.
Your Majesty, it was not the fault of your guards. I climbed the wall at the rear by the plane trees, out of sight of the guards.
In broad daylight.
No, Your Majesty, last night. Your Majesty must not be alarmed.
But the wall is very high there. You might have injured yourself.
No, Your Majesty, I am used to it.
Used to it?
Yes, Your Majesty, on Saturdays. The factory shuts down over Sunday, so I am not obliged to work. I have plenty of time. I can sleep where I like.
Do you spend the night in the open air? In the garden?
It is very pleasant in the summer-time.
Do you mean that in winter?
Just the same, yes, Your Majesty.
She makes a gesture of astonishment.
Only when it freezes, I go into the house with the orangutan. Your Majesty keeps him now on the further side of the parterre. Don't be alarmed, Your Majesty. We are great friends. He is very fond of tarts and roast chestnuts, so you see there is no danger.
Great heaven! Is it possible? Are you in your right mind?
Yes, Your Majesty.
But my good man, what is the object of exposing yourself in midwinter in this fashion, in such singular company?
Your Majesty, really, I don't know whether or not I should tell you.
But you must.
Your Majesty, every night before you retire, and when you get up in the morning, Your Majesty comes out upon the terrace before your apartments. In the evening you look up at the stars. In the morning you feed the white doves.
Yes, I do. Poor things. I like to toss them a few handfuls of corn.
The lover interrupting.
Indian corn.
How do you know?
The wind usually carries some grains off the terrace.
Do you pick them up?
Yes, Your Majesty, when I can, which is not often. The paths are swept every morning, so when night comes they are no longer there.
What? Do you keep them?
Yes, Your Majesty. I have a collection of souvenirs. The grains of corn, a feather from Your Majesty's hat which blew out one day while you were driving, a piece of fur from one of Your Majesty's boas which you wore at the last carnival. It caught in the railing as Your Majesty left the stand. A coin Your Majesty threw from your coach to a little beggar boy in the street. A tortoiseshell hairpin which fell into the garden one morning along with the corn. A pair of gloves. 2 of Your Majesty's slippers. I purchased them from a maid of one of the ladies of the wardrobe. and I don't know what else. You see, it is a little museum. An Englishman offered me £1,000 sterling for it.
The Queen, interested.
What did you do?
Your Majesty, the heart is not for sale.
You must be rich.
No, Your Majesty. I was, that is to say, rich enough. I have made a good living. But now I am poor.
Have you lost your money?
Yes, Your Majesty, but we will not speak of that. It is of no interest to Your Majesty.
But it is. It interests me very much. May I ask?
How I lost my money? Yes, Your Majesty, it is not a secret. Even if it were, since it is Your Majesty. I spent it upon railway tickets, sea voyages, rooms in hotels. Your Majesty is such a great traveller.
Were you following me?
He nods his head in assent.
But this is incredible.
No, Your Majesty, no. Travelling is very expensive. As long as Your Majesty remained in Europe, it was not so bad. But when you made a voyage to India and another to the fair at Chicago, and immediately after a pilgrimage to the Holy Land...
Did you follow me even as far as India?
Yes, Your Majesty. Your Majesty will remember that the voyage was undertaken on account of your health. Your Majesty may not know it, but the doctors agreed that it was a question of life and death. It was necessary for you to have a change of climate. Thanks be to God, Your Majesty recovered, but you might have died on the journey. Your Majesty will understand that, under the circumstances, it was impossible for me to remain in Europe.
Impossible?
Absolutely.
But I cannot consent to have you spend your fortune like this.
Your Majesty, do not give it another thought. It was not exactly a gold mine. A few thousands, that was all. The factory which I had the honour to mention to Your Majesty, the unrivalled makers of butter and cheese, purveyors to Your Majesty, yes, indeed. It was mine. Now it belongs to another. That is all.
But you...
I'm assistant bookkeeper now. I check up the accounts.
That must pay you very little.
Pshaw! Nothing to speak of. It is a humble position. Believe me, Your Majesty, I am capable of much more than that. If not proprietor, I might still have been manager, or foreman at least, only...
Only...
Your Majesty will not be displeased, but I must keep my time free. The fact is, well, I have taken this position because it gives me a living, and...
Looking down at his clothes.
And enough to appear respectable, because it requires only 2 hours a day, from 9:30 until 11:30 in the morning, precisely the hours at which Your Majesty confers with your ministers. Your Majesty will understand.
The Queen laughing.
Certainly. At that same hour we are both at the office.
No, Your Majesty. Your Majesty misinterprets my meaning. I never presume to think. The fact is, well, between those hours my mind is most free. I am able to work without distraction, to apply myself. I am sure that Your Majesty is not upon the streets.
How long do you expect to continue this life?
As long as I am able, Your Majesty, and Your Majesty does not prevent. Your Majesty is not offended at what I have said?
Offended? No, but you must be very unhappy.
No, Your Majesty. Very happy. Very happy. That is, not as happy as I was, because now, when Your Majesty leaves court, I am not always able to travel. Rascally coin. But, fortunately, now Your Majesty travels less. It will not do to ask too much of a fortune. Your Majesty, after what happened this morning, I am repaid for everything which I have suffered in the world. Your Majesty cannot imagine how happy it makes me that is, Your Majesty cannot imagine how glad I am that this incident, although I would have given my life to have prevented it, I mean, Your Majesty understands what I mean.
Yes, I do. Do not distress yourself. I, too, am glad that it was you.
Your Majesty.
Because I have noticed your face for so many years. I have seen you for so long a time.
Your Majesty has noticed me?
Naturally.
Perhaps your Majesty thought that I was a photographer for one of the illustrated papers.
I thought that you were a poet.
No, your Majesty, no, never.
Have you never written verses?
The lover disappointed.
Does your Majesty like verses?
Yes, I am very fond of them.
Goodness gracious. No, your Majesty, no, never, never.
A brightening.
But I know by heart almost all the verses which have been published about your Majesty. Birthday verses, verses celebrating your victories, your works of charity, and so on and so on. There are so many of them. Your Majesty, of course, knows them too.
Not those verses.
Smiling.
God bless us.
But you must not be troubled. One may be a poet and yet not write verses.
Does your Majesty think so?
Certainly, we may write poetry or we may live it.
Deeply affected.
And devotion and self-denial, illusion and dreaming, the sacrifice of one's life to an ideal, an impossibility, these things are also true poetry, great poetry, are they not?
The lover not understanding.
No doubt, your Majesty, no doubt. Of course, since your Majesty says so.
And you are a great poet of life.
Your Majesty says so.
And I, because you are, in memory of this day, of this event, which also is an extraordinary one in my life, I am going to give you a present to add to that collection which you tell me of, and I hardly know, because of your delicacy, your sacrifices really, will you accept this remembrance from me?
She offers him a jewel which she wears upon her breast.
No, no, your Majesty, no, by no means. Really, not that jewel. No, no.
But why not?
Because a jewel is a jewel. That is, it has value in itself. And no, your Majesty, no, no.
I do not wish to give offense.
No, your Majesty, no. It is not that. It is the way I feel, a caprice. If your Majesty would deign to give me some reminder, something personal, perhaps, of no value.
As you wish.
If you would let me have that mirror, your Majesty, after looking into it once.
The Queen looks into the mirror and then hands it to the lover.
There, your Majesty. Thanks. Your Majesty will permit me to kiss your hand?
He kisses it.
Thanks. Thanks, your Majesty. Believe me, your Majesty.
Deeply moved.
This is the happiest day of my life.
I, too, am greatly obliged to you, and I wish to ask you a favor. If at any time you desire anything which is within my power to grant, you will do me a great kindness by coming to me.
The lover hesitating, wishing to ask something.
Your Majesty.
Now, tell me truly, is there nothing that you wish?
Your Majesty? Since your Majesty has been so kind, if your Majesty would exert your influence with the Minister of the Interior to have him grant me a pass over the railways of the kingdom?
You shall have it this very day. Is there nothing else? What is your name?
Matthew, your Majesty. Matthew Brown, your Majesty's humble servant.
The Queen repeating the words so as to fix them in her memory.
Matthew Brown. You shall have it this afternoon. Now you may retire.
She strikes a small silver bell.
And many thanks yet again.
To the lady-in-waiting who enters.
Let this gentleman be escorted to his home, and a note be made of his address.
She bows, dismissing him.
Your Majesty.
Bowing very low, he is about to disappear. But as he reaches the door, he turns and says,
It need not be first class.
Goes out. The Queen, disturbed, pacing up and down the room, without knowing whether to laugh or to cry.
Matthew Brown. Matthew Brown.
To the lady-in-waiting who re-enters.
Has he gone?
Yes, your Majesty. But your Majesty is unwell. Has this man given offence? He has been impertinent.
No, no. On the contrary. Poor fellow.
Was he a poet?
A poet? No. That is, yes, in his way. Imagine, but how can you imagine? My God, this poor man has given his life for me, for to him his cheese factory was his life. 4 centuries ago he would have fought under my banners. He would have conquered a kingdom for my sake. He would have discovered a new world and have laid it at my feet. And now, to see me feed corn to the doves, he sleeps in a cage with the orangutan, and his name is Matthew Brown. Matthew Brown, the lover. The poet was right. We have been born too late into a world which has grown too old.
Curtain. End of The Lover by Gregorio Martinez Sierra.